Hello and welcome to my small office hovel here in Chichester. It's a very cold night. I'm wrapped up in my blanket, which I think I bought this in Sierra Leone actually quite a few years ago. And we wanted to start off the year 2019 with some sort of video blogs, really beginning to explore new monasticism and what it means for us at the Society St Columba here on the south coast of England, what it might mean for us in the future as we take on a 23-acre semi-derelict monocropped farmstead, historic farmstead here in West Sussex, but also what it means about the journey that as Christians, both individual and as a small community, we are beginning to take in God. And we're very excited at the moment because not only have we started to break ground on the farm, principally by debrambling, and we'll be doing more short vignettes on that later over the week, and not only have we been exploring keeping sheep, which anybody that follows our Facebook page and our other website will appreciate. We have a lot of sheep and they're quite an active central part of our community. But we also wanted to begin to look at some of the foundational reasons as to why we recognize that God is calling us into a new monastic expression of faith here in the British Isles. A number of years ago, I wrote a blog entitled Reawakening Our Origins. And I kind of subtitled it as the beginnings of an exploration in British monastic ecclesiology. That's kind of a very clever way of saying Celtic Christianity. But we recognize that God, in the spirit of holiness, is leading us to a Celtic new monasticism in the land. And that takes on a number of signifiers. And I think for me as an individual and for us as a community, we want to mark those significant steps that we take. So in Reawakening Our Origins, we begin to recognize that we all originate in God. And I know for me, as long as I can remember, right the way back, even in my early childhood, I've always been very drawn to stillness. This doesn't, of course, mean that I've always been still. And as those that know me will testify, I'm very rarely quiet. But silence and stillness have over the years become good friends. And the longer that we walk together, the greater an appreciation of their personality I am developing. Silence and stillness, to me, are like two ancient spiritual seers whose call to every generation is to rediscover the divine creator in the simple act of listening and then of holy living. And again, for me, like many of my peers who call themselves Christians, my introductory experience was predominantly charismatic, new church, non-denominational. I've grown up now at 51 to appreciate that there is a life beyond the noise, the ebullient and imminent expectation of a national revival or a resurgence of sort of evangelical social reformers. You know, in and of themselves, these expectations which many people in the country hold, they are fine. This is not me being critical of that way of encountering God. Yet, given the increasing flood of political, social, climate chaos that this Western hegemony that we find ourselves in, I wonder whether that that understanding of what Christianity is truly going to be able to deliver on its promise. You know, to my mind, the Western Church is so embedded in the world's economic structures, and is an active economic participant in it, that it's difficult to see where those aspirations for a revival are going to come from unless we begin to engage our countercultural origins. And of course, you know, we are all products of our culture, you know, our godly encounters and our ecclesiology, and I'm no different. The culture of the late 20th and early 21st century Britain has shaped a particular expression of popular churchmanship that in turn shapes and frames the encounter that I have with God. And this certainly became very apparent to me in recent years as I've listened to the stories recounted by my daughters and their peers around manifestations of the Holy Spirit during worship gatherings at big youth events in the United Kingdom. And I know I went to some of those same youth events when, you know, in my early mid-20s, and it would appear that not a lot has changed since I was going to those events. So for me, the journey from conversion, charismatic encounter, through to my encounter with Christ in the poor in Ethiopia, the subsequent contemplative activism that occurred in my life, this pursuit of God as a God of moral justice, and then more latterly into a place where creational wholeness is becoming more and more required in my life and in the life of our community. It does represent a continuum of spiritual peregrination, pilgrimage. And when we view that through the eyes of faith, it's both very instructive and life-affirming. For me, this journey is authentic, and it is also spiritually turbulent. Authentic in as much as it is progressive. I don't mean politically progressive, that's a nonsense. Progressive in the sense that I am still in spiritual motion towards my Creator. After all, you know, dead people don't move. And if there is no movement, if there is no motion to becoming more like Christ, then you are probably dead or dying. Life is always in motion. And if working on the land over the last 2 to 3 years has taught me anything, life is growing, straining, searching for the light. But it is also turbulent, as all genuine spiritual growth and discipleship creates a worldly resistance that must be overcome. And that worldly resistance is not external, it is internal. My own inner resistance to change, my own need to be safe, to be secure, to be financially in position, to make sure that I have not taking any risks around the next step in my life. You know, this inner resistance, the inner resistance we encounter is always focused around what are the priorities in our lifestyle and those subsequent allegiances that we allow into our hearts. You know, St. Mark was kind of unequivocal in his assessment on this point when he retold, or in his telling of Jesus's parable of the sower. You know, the cares of the world stifle genuine faith. And as we get older, the cares of the world, the financial obligations of the world, and children, and prestige, and ego, they bear down upon us, and we take fewer and fewer risks, even though we may engage in a more radical narrative. The cares of the world will stifle genuine faith. And I know for those of us in the Society of St Columba, we are mindful that we need to keep growing, and therefore we need to be actively discomforting ourselves to pursue God. It's interestingly a very Celtic way of seeing the world. And I recently completed some studies in Celtic Christianity with the University of Wales, and during those studies I came to the conviction that we really can't afford the luxury of allowing something as dynamic and life transforming and creation transforming as Celtic Christianity to remain in the hands of the academics. Celtic Christianity is an amazingly wonderful indigenous lens through which we can seek the kingdom of God with great optimism and hope. Yet perhaps the most pertinent aspect of my studies was the realization that the British and Irish monastic church, which we now call the Celtic Church, was an ecclesiology. There was a frame that nurtured this kind of radical holiness. So Celtic Christianity for us must now migrate into the hands of practitioners, into the hands of the builders, the farmers, the creational activists, the spiritual entrepreneurs whose focus is on living a Christian witness that is rooted in the simplicity of prayer, daily work, reading, study. And what makes it indigenous is that it's rooted, it's grounded, it's earthed in our green and pleasant land. If I can quote William Blake for a moment. So my purpose in undertaking the MA was to explore that simple ecclesiology of indigenous monastic church. And my inspiration was St Columba, who really was an archetype for me and has been an archetype for many people of what it means to be a truly sort of Celtic Christian. He established a number of monastic houses, both in Ireland and on mainland Britain, particularly in and around Scotland. A lot of that is recorded in Andaman's Life of St Columba. Andaman was the 7th abbot of Iona. And there was a monastic rule that was written in the late 7th century, probably early 8th century, which really kind of distilled down the essence of what it must have been like to live in one of those monastic houses. And this Columban charism was archetypal of the British and Irish monastic flourishing between the 5th to 9th centuries. So arriving at the door of this almost forgotten practice has been an amazing adventure. It's been a distillation of my life experience, a creational awakening, a longing for spiritual authenticity. But it is also a recognition, and I say this as somebody who spent many years of my life campaigning for rights and for justice for the poor, for the marginalised, etc., etc. It is a recognition that the world system cannot deliver on the aspirations that we all feel for a better future for our children, our communities, and our human longing to find social meaning and purpose. If I have learned anything in my 51 years on this planet, which isn't many, the kingdom of heaven is not political and cannot be brought about through political means. It is an incarnational life lived beyond the shallow politics of the state. So arriving at this ecclesiology of the monastic church has been the culmination of numerous factors that have focused my heart, my mind, and my spirit on a grounded response to the human, economic, and ecological crisis that the world system continues to live in. And as we've all seen in the last 2 or 3 years particularly, the climate crisis is accelerating that dystopia. And I would summarize this, I'd summarize this obsession as follows: the normalization of the pursuit of wealth as an ideal human condition. The unfettered pursuit of profit is not a noble thing. It is an aberration. The second point would be rampant consumerism that has led to an explosion of unsustainable personal debt. The levels of debt in the UK that are held by households are staggering and simply not sustainable. A lot of what underpins this unsustainable debt crisis in our personal lives is the alignment of political power with the pursuit of wealth. We hear regularly how politicians are in the pockets of corporations and how corporations are now becoming the politicians who own the pockets. And that unholy alignment has normalized wealth and excessive wealth as some sort of noble virtue. Again, at a very basic level, the commodification of the land as a resource to be exploited and consumed. This I'm very familiar with only in as much as I spent 20 years working with small-scale gold miners who earn $1 a day. And I have watched how transnational mining companies and governments have aligned over land ownership and have displaced hundreds of thousands of people in order to get to the wealth that will never be seen by the country of origin, but will sit on balance sheets in tax havens around the world or in bank vaults as gold doré bars. And perhaps, and most, I suppose, upsetting for me as a Christian who genuinely believes that the gospel of Jesus Christ has the power to transform life in all of its manifestations. And I live in the West. The impotence of the Western church to demonstrate a cohesive alternative way of life in the face of this world system. There's so much that I could say on that, and that perhaps will be for another day. But the growing frustration amongst many thousands of Christians in the UK, those people that love Jesus, they love justice, they love the world, they are filled with love, and yet they are so frenetically agitated, discontent, disturbed by how the Western church just simply cannot seem to puncture its radical alternative through into the consciousness of the people. It is so frustrating. We spend all of our time talking to ourselves, and maybe I'm just perpetuating that by doing this video blog. But our acquiescence to the power structures of the world as the defining authority on how we live our lives has denuded our Christian witness of authenticity. And it has led society as a whole to disregard the church as a cultural artifact at best. You know, Wendell Berry is a big hero of mine. And in his essay on racism and the economy, that Christian agrarian mystic, and he is a mystic, said this, and he's absolutely on the money, if I can use that metaphor. The great enemy of freedom is the alignment of political power with wealth. This alignment destroys the commonwealth, that is, the natural wealth of localities and the local economies of households, neighbourhood and community, and so destroys democracy, of which the Commonwealth is the foundation and practical means. This is happening. It is happening because the alignment of wealth and power permits economic value to overturn value of any other kind. It's true. We know it's true. In my 30 years of being a Christian, I have come to the realization that despite the rhetoric and the efforts of well-meaning missional groups focusing on confessional conversions, as a body politic, the current Western Protestant church is failing in its basic purpose of making disciples and liberating, this is critical, liberating these disciples from the destructive values of the world. Jesus said the following: you cannot serve God and wealth. In the Aramaic, in the English translation of the Aramaic, Jesus actually says you cannot serve God and money. It is the starkest choice that Jesus presents his followers with. You can't have one or the other. Western Orthodoxy has overwhelmingly ignored this basic maximum in favour of a Christianized version of the pursuit of wealth and material comfort. We now have a proliferation of churches, and this is not every church in the country, but we have a proliferation of churches, church leaders and members whose only point of distinction from worldly values is an intellectual confession of faith. We are simply indistinct from the wider world. And this cultural settlement is an anathema to the teachings and the life of Jesus. Christianity is an incarnational faith. It is not primarily a confessional faith. My life is my confession. And that is where God's supreme grace begins to work its way into the fabric of my life. Because if my life is my confession, I am in deep shit. Because I know what my life is. And I know that my life needs help. Like we all need help. So as we begin to rediscover our origins in God, we discover that God gives us a grace within a grace to begin to walk. And this for us is, for me, is the core heartbeat of what it is to be a Christian. It is simply to follow and imitate Christ, to live as Christ lived, to believe what Jesus believed, and to do the things that he did. Believing in Jesus is no longer enough. We must live as Jesus lived. And so if the origins of our life in God are reawakened, maybe this is where we begin. We begin with the imitation of Christ as our role model. So, thank you for being so jolly nice and listening. And I'm going to do one of these again, which will be the second part of this 3-part mini-series. And I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do leave some comments. You might think I need deep psychiatric treatment. I think that regularly. But I believe this stuff. And I genuinely think that if we can reawaken our original purpose in God, both as individuals and as communities, we might begin to smell differently. So thank you very much. Do look us up at www.st-columba.com. Subscribe to the podcast, all those usual things that we say. We're on Facebook. Check out our sheep, blah, blah, blah. Love you very much. Thanks a lot. Bye.